The Thing is a 1982 film directed by John Carpenter. It is widely regarded as a cult classic and is my favourite horror movie. But that's not the thing we're talking about today. The Thing is also the name given to an ingenious listening device created by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If you're wondering why its name is so nondescript, it's because nothing like it had ever been seen before, and the device was responsible for one of the most severe US security breaches of the entire Cold War. On August 4th, 1945, the Second World War was nearing its final conclusion. Germany had surrendered, and Japan would be subjected to its first atomic attack only 2 days later. Naturally, people were beginning to think about the world that was to come after the end of this conflict. The United States and Soviet Union, wartime allies but ideological opposites, understood that they would be the dominant forces in the post-war world, and were making various diplomatic gestures towards one another. On this day in August, United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union, William Averell Harriman, was greeted by a delegation from the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization of the Soviet Union, basically the Soviet equivalent of the Boy Scouts. These young pioneers, aged between 9 and 14, presented the ambassador with a large and beautifully carved maple wood rendition of the Great Seal of the United States. Touched by this gesture, and taking the generosity of these rosy-cheeked young Soviets at face value, Ambassador Harriman hung the seal in his study at Spaso House, the US ambassador's official residence in Moscow. What the ambassador was not aware of, however, was that within this gift was concealed a wireless listening device, and he had therefore unknowingly allowed the Soviets to bug his office. In fairness to Harriman, this technology was groundbreaking, the brainchild of Soviet inventor Leon Theremin, who also invented and gave his name to this neat doohickey. Very cool. At this time, Theremin was working in a gulag alongside other imprisoned scientists producing devices for the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The listening device was a resonant cavity microphone and relied on electromagnetic energy, only becoming active when radio signals of a certain frequency were beamed at it. This would be achieved via a strong radio signal emitter located in a nearby building, or possibly a van parked outside the embassy. The device was hidden underneath the beak of the eagle on the seal, transmitting audio loud and clear to Soviet listeners only when illuminated using radio waves. It is unlikely that many people could have conceived of such a device, let alone the deviousness of concealing it within a gift supposedly made by children for a wartime ally. The genius of the thing lay in the fact that it had no power supply, nor any active electronic components. It wasn't even constructed with any ferrous materials, so it would not be picked up by a metal detector. This meant that, when not actively illuminated by radio, the thing was very difficult to detect. It was, however, this radio illumination which would lead to the discovery of the thing. 7 years after it was mounted in the ambassador's study, being uncovered in 1952. 4 different ambassadors had resided in Spaso House in the meantime, with George Kennan holding the role at the time of the thing's discovery, appointed in March of that year. The Cold War was well underway by this point, and, in the autumn of 1951, a British radio operator working in the Moscow British Embassy was monitoring an open Soviet Air Force radio channel when he overheard a conversation in English and was even surprised to recognize the voice of the British air attaché to Moscow. Confused, he reported this discovery, and the British Diplomatic Wireless Service dispatched engineer Don Bailey to investigate. Though he was unable to discover the source of the transmission, he did allegedly report his suspicion that the Soviets were experimenting with a resonance device. An American State Department radio operator, using a wideband receiver, also picked up an audio transmission, seemingly coming from the US ambassador's residence, which he duly reported. Already concerned that their embassy had been bugged, the US State Department dispatched 2 employees, John W. Ford and Joseph Bejian, to the American, British, and Canadian embassies to investigate. Initially, the pair were unable to discover anything out of the ordinary, though Bejian was suspicious, and so was Kennan, who later recalled, "We had long since taught ourselves to assume that in Moscow, most walls, at least in rooms that diplomats were apt to frequent, had ears." Soviet workers had been employed to renovate Spaso House in early 1952 in anticipation of Kennan's arrival in May. This alarmed him, though several sweeps uncovered nothing suspicious. This came as a surprise, as Soviet listening bugs had been discovered in various embassies across Eastern Europe during the late 1940s. Believing that the Soviets had been tipped off and had somehow concealed their devices, Joseph Bejian returned to Spaso House in September 1952 to conduct another sweep, though this time he posed as a house guest for 3 days and had his equipment delivered separately. Utilising a crystal video receiver as a signal generator and instructing Ambassador Kennan to read miscellaneous declassified text aloud, Bejian discovered the device as the Soviets had begun actively illuminating it during this sweep, generating audio feedback from the signal generator. This feedback is called a howl round, and you've probably experienced it if you've ever brought a microphone close to a loudspeaker. Very noisy. Homing in on the source of the feedback, Bejian removed the seal from the wall, but was surprised to find nothing behind it. Stranger still was that the feedback had stopped abruptly. Opening up the seal, Bejian discovered a cavity carved into the wood, and inside, a small, seemingly inert device, which he removed for inspection. He was perplexed by the possibility that this device had been remotely deactivated, as he could not see any visible power source. He was sufficiently worried about the device being stolen that he slept with it beneath his pillow that night. The device was remounted in the seal, and the whole thing was sent to Washington, D.C. the next day, where it was shown to President Harry S. Truman by Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Truman turned the thing over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for examination, and on September 22nd, he established a special committee comprised of the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency to assess the threat posed by such devices. Over the following weeks, the thing was analysed by no less than the FBI, CIA, US State Department, Naval Research Laboratory, MI5, and Marconi, a British telecommunications company. All were initially taken aback by the unusual simplicity of the device, which earned it the nickname The Thing. However, the FBI quickly ascertained that the device was a resonance cavity microphone, and by December 1952, they had compiled a comprehensive technical report on the thing with the help of the Naval Research Laboratory. This report was circulated among other US intelligence agencies, and, acting on the orders of President Truman, development began on tools specifically designed to detect such resonance cavity microphones. Additional detail on the investigation was provided by British counterintelligence savant Peter Wright, a technician with the Marconi Company, and later MI5 assistant director, who wrote about his own participation in his 1987 book Spycatcher. According to Wright, the FBI were at a loss on how to get the device working, and sought help from MI5. Upon examining the device, Wright discovered that, while the FBI had activated it at 1,800 megacycles to produce the so-called howl round detected by Joseph Bejian, its operating frequency was much lower, at 800 megacycles. This apparently fully activated the microphone and solved the mystery. However, the FBI report, declassified and released to the public in 2019, does not mention this detail, and it is apparent from the report that the FBI were able to quite quickly and comprehensively deconstruct and operate the device, giving the operating frequency as 1,700 megacycles. Does this mean Wright was exaggerating his involvement? Maybe not. Wright mentions in his book that an American scientist had accidentally put his finger through the microphone's diaphragm, puncturing it, and that this had to be replaced before he started his examination. The FBI report mentions that the microphone's diaphragm was indeed punctured and had to be replaced, though it does not elaborate on how this damage occurred or who replaced it. It's unlikely that Wright was privy to the FBI's report, and it was declassified 25 years after his death, so at the very least, he seems to have been involved with the investigation. It's also interesting to note that Spycatcher was initially banned from publication in England by Margaret Thatcher's government due to some very serious allegations Wright made against the British government and intelligence services, which included a plot to force the resignation of Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson. As late as 2023, the UK's Cabinet Office was blocking the release of files relating to the book's banning, despite the UK's 30-year rule, allowing the release of most government documents 30 years after their creation. In any case, the thing inspired Wright, who went on to produce his own resonance cavity device for MI5, known as Satyr, which, in a very British fashion, utilised modified umbrellas as sending and receiving antennas. For their part, the CIA were able to produce their own brand of resonance cavity microphones, known as Easy Chair, which, according to journalist David Wise, they used to spy on the Soviet embassy in The Hague in 1958. Despite, or perhaps because, of the severity of this security breach, the existence of the thing was not publicly revealed until 1960, in the aftermath of the U-2 incident that year, during which American pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. The Soviets publicly accused the United States of spying on them in a heated meeting of the United Nations Security Council. To save face, the US delegation, headed by Ambassador to the UN Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., produced the thing, complete with the replica Great Seal it was mounted in, to show the world that the Soviets had been spying too, and long before the U-2 incident.
Go ahead, open it up. And here is the clandestine listening device. You can see the antenna in the aerial, and it was right under the beak of the eagle.
The technological legacy of the thing extends far beyond the world of espionage. This method of transmitting information via retransmitted radio waves would bring about the creation of RFID, radio frequency identification, something we use constantly in day-to-day life. The first true RFID device was patented in 1973 by American inventor Mario Cardullo, and was designed to work as a toll device, though he envisioned the device being used for a wide variety of purposes, including vehicle identification, electronic manifests, banking, and security. And yeah, he was pretty much right on the money there. Nowadays, a huge number of daily conveniences utilise this technology. For example, my passport has an RFID chip inside it, which stores all of my personal information necessary for international and domestic travel. Tapping it against an RFID reader will let me through a gate at an airport. Similarly, my debit card has an RFID chip, which can be scanned to allow for contactless payment transactions. I'm afraid I'm not showing my debit card on camera. Sorry. I can also get in and out of the office at work using an RFID keycard, so there are some real-world benefits to all of this spy business. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed that latest episode of Tales from the Cold War. If so, feel free to like, and please do subscribe if you haven't already. Also, as mentioned in my previous episode, I do now have a Patreon account, so if you'd like to keep up to date on all my projects, please do consider checking that out. But once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.